Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us and a very warm welcome to our 1-hour lunchtime opportunity for councillors from all across the country to share with the National Education Union in thinking about the next steps that are required to bring about the necessary support and the necessary delivery of quality but safe education in all our education workplaces all across the country. Just going to run through a few technical details for you. First of all, please feel free to just drop any comments or questions, or even just to say where you're from in the chat. That will be available and visible to all of you throughout the session. I also need to let you know that this call is being both recorded and live streamed. So just be aware that if you are making any contributions, either in the chat or later in the question and answer session, that will be, as I say, recorded and visible to others. And with that in mind, if you do feel strongly about a particular issue and you wish to raise it with us, just please do so with due respect and integrity for all those on the call. Very grateful to Sam Riddle. You already see her on the screen. She's providing our BSL interpretation for today. Our special advertised guest is Joint General Secretary Kevin Courtney, and I'm delighted that unadvertised but a surprise guest also with us today is our other Joint General Secretary, Mary Booster. We're going to be hearing from Kevin and Mary by way of introduction at the beginning of this session, and then we're going to be opening up to question and answer. So if I can explain a little about that now to help you before we get there. For the questions and answers, we would ask you, please, if you want Mary or Kevin to respond to you in this call, we would ask you to put that question in the Q&A function. You'll find that by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Type your question in there, and it will be even more helpful if you indicate that you are willing to ask your question live. We can open up and allow you to be unmuted and on the screen to ask a question live if you wish to. So put your question in Q&A, put live after the question if you want to be called on to read your question out, to put it directly to the panel. I'm very ably supported by Amy, Vin, Mike and Henry behind the scenes on this, and they will be collating the questions you submit and then feeding them through to the panel. As I say, put it in Q&A if it's a question, put live afterwards if you want to be able to put that question unmuted to the panel. I'm Robin Bevan. I'm the National President of the NEU for this year. I'm a serving head teacher of a large secondary school in Essex, so I absolutely understand the issues that all our workforce members are facing across the country at this challenging time. We have over 100 councillors signed up to join us today. So far, we've got a good number registered and calling in, but of course, please be aware that the live streaming is also happening, so we won't know for certain who is watching or listening. At which point, thank you for joining us. I'm going to hand over to Kevin Courtney, Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you all of you for joining this call. I'm really pleased that Mary's here as well. So I'm going to say something about why we called for schools to be in the 4-week lockdown. We appreciate that was a controversial call by us. And I'm also going to say something about why, given that that hasn't happened, we think it is all the more urgent that methods are found and implemented to break viral transmission in schools. And then I'm going to hand over to Mary, who will talk about some other aspects, exams, assessment, etc. And we hope to leave plenty of time for questions. So thank you again for being here. So behind the reason why we called for schools to be in the closure, I want to make clear it wasn't because we think that schools are unsafe for children because of this virus. We accept the science that children are basically not badly affected. You know, there are always terrible individual cases, but terrible individual things happen everywhere. Children aren't fundamentally at risk. What we are concerned about is that we think the lockdown may not work anything like as well as it should work if we exclude so many people from it. And we're also concerned that there is viral transmission in schools. And unless we set that back or have really stringent measures in place, then schools are inevitably going to be hugely disrupted. There is a substantial degree of disruption already, and it is still growing. So the reason that we think the lockdown might not work as well as it should, we hope that it does, obviously, but there are 8.8 million pupils in schools in England, and there are 500,000 teachers, and then there's a similar number of support staff, so that we are talking about 10 million people who could be at home for 4 weeks and who aren't, and who are in environments where they are meeting. So the government on the one hand says, you know, stay at home if you can, but we're not saying that about schools. Now, we understand there is a balance around this, and children being at home is not the right place for, you know, it's not what we want, but we are very worried that this lockdown will turn out to be a half measure. So we think it would have been better if the government had done what Sage said and had a lockdown in September. We think it would have been better if they'd followed the calls for a circuit break over half term, when they could have had a period of school closure that was just there normally. We think that if they'd extended that to 2 weeks, then that might have worked in a really positive way. So that's why we called for it. It's about the chance of the virus spreading in our society wholesale, and the implication of the virus spreading in schools, because we really do have strong evidence of viral transmission in schools. The data set that we are looking at around that most regularly is a data set from the Office of National Statistics. It is updated every Friday around lunchtime, and I'm looking at my emails looking to see when we get the next update of those figures. But the ONS data is not based on people turning up for tests who have symptoms. Instead, as you probably know, they test a random selection of 150,000 people a week. So they test asymptomatic people, and they find those with symptoms and they find those without symptoms. And they from that, they establish how the virus is spreading. And they have recently, they've always had all the data, but they've recently started breaking that data out in school age groups. So they now report on children from age 2 to year group 6, and then from year group 7 to year group 11, and then from year group 12 to age 24, and then they break out the other age demographics from that. So we've been looking at that data set, which finds asymptomatic cases. And we are incredibly worried about what we see in secondary schools in particular. There is concern in primary schools, but in secondary schools in particular, this data set is quite alarming. That group of children, and I don't mean by alarming that the children are at risk. I mean, it's alarming for what's going to happen in our schools, about the level of disruption that our schools will see. So that age group from age 7, year 7 to year 11, so the main years in secondary school running up to GCSE, had the lowest rate of COVID virus of any age demographic on the 1st of September, according to the ONS. But then it has been increasing faster than any other age demographic as well. So as university students went up dramatically in their age group, obviously after universities opened up halfway through September. And then there was a steep increase in the university age group. In secondary schools, it started a bit slower, but by the end of September, the case rate in secondary schools was 15 times what it was on the 1st of September. By October the 8th, it was 23 times what it was at the 1st of September. And by October the 22nd, it was 50 times what it was by the 1st of September. It's at a rate of 2%, and people can have different views about whether 2% is a big number or a low number. When you're in the foothills of an exponentially growing pandemic, and when the rate is growing, is doubling every fortnight, then 2% potentially becomes 4% after 2 weeks and 8% after 4 weeks. But 2% is already quite a high number. it means that in an average 3 classes of 30 children, 90 children, then there's a good chance you've got 2 children with the virus in every group of 3 classes. In some areas of the country, that's higher. So that's the concern that we have, is based on the data from the ONS, there is the age group that is growing most rapidly, growing even faster than the university students, is that secondary age group, doubling every 2 weeks and now at 50 times what it was at the beginning of September. And it's not just that that's one number, but it's got other consequences. Because the fact that children have the virus, some of them get positive tests, then other children have to be excluded. And so we've seen a pattern since September. We started back with 90% attendance. We have then seen attendance dropping. It went up slightly after the government changed regulations. They were excluding bubbles very commonly. Then they changed it so they were excluding just children who were closer contacts of children who had positives. But even after that scaling back of that safety measure, attendance has continued to worsen. So in the last week that we had records for, 20% of secondary students were not in school. That's a very high level of non-attendance, and we are worried that it will continue to grow. You already see a geographically different pattern arising from the fact that the virus is different geographically. So in that week when it was on average 20% across the country, in Knowsley, it was 40% of secondary school students were not in school. Now that is incredibly disruptive to education. And if we don't find a way of breaking the virus transmission, if it does go from 2% to 4% to 8%, then far more children will be excluded from school. So that is why we called for schools to be in the circuit break, to get the numbers down to a place where test, track, trace can try and keep the numbers down. And we were also arguing, and are still arguing, that we should have used that time to get ready for other measures to try and break transmission, particularly in secondary schools, but across the piece. So one measure that we want the government to look at is the tests that they are rolling out in Liverpool now, these 15-minute turnaround rapid tests that you do on asymptomatic people. If they are making those work, then we want schools to be in the first rank of the people where those tests happen. If we can find the children with cases and they go home, then obviously we can reduce that level of transmission. So if they can make that work, we want schools to be in the first tier of it. If that's not available, and we don't think it's going to be available on the timescale of 4 weeks, it's a trial in Liverpool that lasts practically the whole of that time. So there's no expectation, unfortunately, that that will be available in secondary schools at the end of this 4-week period. We think there has to be a really serious look at moving secondary schools to Rota operation. And by that, we mean the staff being in school every day, the teachers and the support staff being in school every day, but the students being in school half the time, 1 week on, 1 week off, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, something of that nature. The children young people would be taught every lesson, but half of them they would be taught physically and half of them they would be taught remotely. So the sort of working pattern for a teacher might be that they teach their year 9, their year 10 class physically, then they go to their year 11 classroom and they teach that class remotely. We have some lived experience of this working in sixth form colleges on that sort of pattern, and on a slightly different pattern where half the alphabet are in 1 week, half the alphabet in the next, where the children are taught, half the class is taught physically and half the class are being engaged remotely at the same time. This is obviously not as good as being taught all your lessons physically, but we understand from SAGE that they think that such a measure has the same sort of level of effect on the virus as closing the whole of hospitality. So it's a relatively big effect on virus transmission. And obviously it means that only half the young people are traveling to school every day on public transport or on school transport. Only half the children are in school every day, meaning there is more space for social distancing in school. Only half the children are at home, and not transmitting to one another, therefore. And that's why SAGE think it has this sort of level of effect on the virus. So we think this might be a compromise between continuing education as fully as we can, and this would be children being taught every lesson. This isn't the situation we had in March. The teachers would be in school every lesson, every day, teaching every lesson every day, and the young people would be being communicated with regularly. They'd be seeing their teachers half the time, and then they'd be being taught remotely half the time. And if that compromise can break the level of virus transmission in schools, then we think that would be something that should really be researched and looked at. We have produced a paper on this that we've shared with a variety of people. We've got the second iteration of that paper coming out today, looking at the examples, looking at the evidence for it. You'll know that the government had started down the path of looking at this. In the contain documents, they talk about tiers of education, and the second tier is of secondary schools being on a rota basis. We regret that government hasn't, as far as we can see, done any substantial planning, even scenario planning for if this has to happen. We're worried that it will have to happen, especially because we think the lockdown won't be as effective without schools being in it, and therefore we'll have, the chances are that cases will start rising again. So I'm sorry, that's quite a long presentation. I hope we've given you some flavour of our thinking about it. We believe, despite what some of the press say, that we are being incredibly responsible in the way that we're talking about this. And we believe that we are talking about the best ways of having continuity of education for our young people, and of trying to avoid the level of disruption that we're seeing in Knowsley at the moment, with 40% of children not in school, and worried that those numbers will increase. So we think that we've got right and science on our side in the things that we've been saying.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And just before I hand over to Mary, just a couple of brief reflections on that. I think that the stunning figure, the one that is most compelling there, is the fact that we've entered a national lockdown, new stage of national restrictions, but 10 million people in the country are going to schools and colleges, whether they're pupils, adult learners, teachers, lecturers, support staff. They're going to schools and colleges where they're gathering together in proximal groups, in overcrowded classrooms, in corridors that can barely manage a normal period of time. 10 million. And so if we don't have a response that actually includes schools and colleges, it's not an effective response at all. And the second thing that you mentioned, Kevin, is about rota systems. And here it is very simply. If you don't have a planned rota system, then what you're actually going to have is students in and out of school on an ad hoc basis because of infection and isolation. So it's a choice between one or the other. We've invited you on this call today, councillors from all over the country. Thank you for introducing yourselves on the chat. We've invited you so that you can hear the presentation, but also to ask questions. We've got a good number of questions coming through on the Q&A function. Please do find that on the screen, type your questions in, and we're happy to take those in any combination. If you want to ask your question live, just put in brackets after the end of the question live, and we'll open up and unmute you, bring you onto the panel so that you can ask that question. We've already got some councillors happy to do that. At which point I'm going to hand over to Mary. After Mary will be the Q&A, so make sure that you've got your question in now if you want to ask it later. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Robin. I just want to say one more thing about rotas. We are producing the guidance today, updated guidance, but the experience of our members who are operating rotas in sixth form colleges is that if students have the equipment, they do need the equipment at home. And that's why the government saying that, putting a directive in law that schools and colleges have to provide remote learning, and then writing to school leaders on the Friday before half term, just telling them then that their allocation of laptops was going to be absolutely drastically reduced because the DfE can't find the laptops. It's telling someone they've got to do something, but taking away the means to do it. That's a real issue, particularly as the feedback we're getting from the chief executives of multi-academy trusts is that rotas are now, because they are having to deal with such significant staff absence as teachers are isolating because they've been in contact with pupils or with each other with COVID, because they're having to deal with such staff absence, They are now saying very clearly to the Department for Education and to government ministers, and these are usually some of their very strong allies, you know, you've got in your tiered guidance that at some point you move to rotas, you're going to have to invoke that tiers because I can't run the school on this basis. And if you don't move to rotas, I'm just going to do it myself. So really thinking about that is really, really important. I just wanted to say something about exams. We asked our members who work in secondary schools just before we did our conference about 4 weeks ago, what they thought about the government's views on exams. So at the moment, the government is saying about GCSE and A-level that the exams will be delayed for 3 weeks, and then they will take place largely unchanged from 2019. Now, we think that this is just an untenable position. We are trying to argue very strongly with Gavin Williamson and with Nick Gibb that this is untenable. We are not being listened to, and we fear that what happened this summer, the exam fiasco of this summer, which was so distressing for both parents and students and for teachers and schools and colleges, is going to happen again. At present, the government's proposals are that exams will be delayed for 3 weeks, but then they will go ahead largely unchanged from 2019 with virtually the same subject content and with the same number of exams. So here's the proposition. You delay exams by 3 weeks. You crowbar them into a shorter period of time. And the government seriously saying that GCSE students will be able to take about 30 exams, which is approximately what they take in a 3 week period. Now, we think this is untenable for all sorts of reasons. It's untenable because we don't know where we'll be in the summer. It may well be that many students, if we don't have a vaccine, many students are still having to isolate. Many schools might be closed. They might be operating on a rota basis. They might be operating on a completely remote basis for some schools. We think it's untenable because how can you examine pupils on the same exam content when they've missed 5 months of in-school teaching, and when that gap has most severely impacted upon disadvantaged students, 700,000 of whom don't either have internet access at home or don't have laptops, so they can't access remote learning. We think it's untenable because you can't make up 5 months missed in school teaching with 3 extra weeks. It's just not possible. So, and when we asked our members what they thought about this, the results were really stark. So just 7% of teachers in secondary schools said that a 3 week delay would make exams fair. So that's 93% of teachers do not believe that a 3 week delay will make exams fair. And most teachers expect that by the time and this was done just about 3 weeks after the start of term, when COVID figures were much lower. So these results would be worse if we surveyed teachers again. Just the vast majority of them think that they will have been able to teach about 80% of course content. That number will have gone down. So teachers will now believe, because so many students are now isolating and missing school, that they will be able to teach less of that course content. And of course, the issue is that this impacts most on disadvantaged students in areas where there's high rates of infection. So if you look at Knowsley, as Kevin said, in the week before half term, 40% of secondary schools students not in school. If you look at Calderdale, 39% of secondary school students not in school. So it's in those areas of high deprivation where where it's going to be the most impact. Now, and that's why Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham called for GCSEs and A-levels to be cancelled. Now, we're not making that call at the moment. We did a joint paper with ASCL and the NHT, the other leadership unions, with the NASUWT and with the National Governors Association. And we sent that to the government about a month ago. And we said, you have to do the following things. You have to reduce the number of exam papers. So you've got to have fewer exam papers, but exam papers which can assess the whole range of ability, so that they carry a greater load in terms of assessment, because the fewer exams there actually are, the more chance they can be timetabled. We said that exams had to have every major topic on the syllabus had to be included in the exam, because teachers teach the syllabus in different orders. So if you're not going to get through the whole of the syllabus, you need to know the bits that you have been able to teach are on the exam. That's the only way of guaranteeing a modicum of fairness for students. And crucially, we said the government should not be in the position of the algorithm's fair, the algorithm's fair, the algorithm's the best thinks it's sliced bread, oh dear, it's a mutant algorithm. We need a plan B for teachers and lecturers in colleges and schools in order that they can gather evidence during the course of the year that if exams can't be taken, if pupils have to isolate, if centres can't be open, then there is agreed evidence on which you can base a student's grade. So this exam boards could, for example, say to schools, you have to do these range of assessments. So you've got common assessments on which grades could be awarded. You've got to do these projects. So you've got common projects on which grades could be awarded. The government's response to this is, well, we'll base it all on more exams, mock exams and further exams in July. And the problem of putting all your assessment eggs into the exams basket has been made abundantly clear this year. And why the government wants to carry on doing what it failed to do this year is just affecting us all. Now, we're not pushing big on this yet because we think safety is the key thing in our members' minds. But I tell you this, as councillors, as it comes to January, and as particularly middle-class parents realise how much schooling their children are missing, and they hear from their teachers how much of the course has not been covered, they will start to agitate on this. And it's a cut-through issue, just the same as Dominic Cummings taking an eyesight test in Barnard Castle. It is it's as big a cut-through issue as this. We have really tried to work with government, and we continue to try to work to get them to see sense, but we're not seeing action on this yet. But we think that this is going to be a major issue next year, and it's one that will fill up your post bags very fully, very completely come January or February next year. Thanks, Robin.
Thank you very much, Mary. And I'm just going to once again remind everybody who's on the call that we're live streaming what's going out. So you have the opportunity to contribute to that, either through asking questions or through the chat column. I just want to remind you again, if you are sharing thoughts in the chat column, please do set your to button so that it reads all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, it's only the small group of us on the panel who get to see what you've got to say. So Cordelia Law, you made a very sound comment, as did John Wiseman. But John and Cordelia, both of your comments were only shared with the panel rather than with everybody who's on the call. So if you want to repost those, it would be very welcome indeed. We're going to take our first question. It's a live question. I'm going to be calling on Matthew Hulbert. And if we can have Matthew on the screen so he's able to ask his question. And once we've got him up on the screen, we will be able to also just hear from Matthew, perhaps where he is from in the country. At the moment, Matthew is not coming. I'm just waiting to see if our fabulous tech team, there we go. Matthew, we can see your image. You are unmuted. Matthew, perhaps if you would introduce yourself very briefly and just then read your question for us. Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, hi. So good to be with you. So I'm Matthew Hulbert. I'm a parish councillor in Barwell in Leicestershire, and also the co-author of the Lib Dems National Policy on the youth service. And so my kind of concern in education is primarily on the youth work end. Which I know is not generally what you've been talking about today, but the fact is, you know, lots of youth clubs have those that remain that haven't been decimated are not open at the moment. Lots of detached youth work isn't going on. So I'm just wondering how this feeds into what you've been saying.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That's a crucial question and a crucial issue, and I'm going to expand it. I'm going to pass it over to Kevin to answer, but as I do so, I think I want to expand it to include field centres as well for outdoor activity and for environmental residentials, because this is all part of the same extended provision, so vital for our young people, but under threat at the moment. Kevin, if you would, thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you very much, Matthew, for the question. Thank you for being on the call. We're pleased that we've got councillors from all parties on the call. You're really pleased that you're here with us today. And you're right, it's not the major thing that we've been talking about in our expressions here, but as a union, we are entirely committed to the notion that our young people need a broader education, and we are working with a variety of people looking for a broader education. And we think it's simply scandalous, the rundown of youth work and youth education that has gone on across well, many years, we think now. Obviously, there are different complications around the lockdown period, around youth work, and I'm not up to date with where the restrictions lie on that, but we think that was a major problem during the lockdown, was young people being stuck at home like everyone else. So we want there to be chances for children to be out as much as possible. I'm just going to go back and say that's why we wanted schools in this lockdown now, because we think we need to get the cases down low enough that schools can remain open for longer, and then we can have clubs and some youth work going on after school as well.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm going to take the next set of questions as a pair, and they're both being submitted in written form. So I'm going to read out Soraya's question. Soraya, welcome to the call. Not sure where in the country you're from. Perhaps you could post that in the chat so everybody knows. But Soraya asks the following question. She says, with our schools and local authorities underfunded, continuing education from home remains problematic for those families without online access. Current provision extends to the most vulnerable, but there are many more students from families on low wages who are overlooked in this. Campaigning should also be focusing on this. COVID will be with us for the foreseeable future. Rota systems is a tangible way forward, but without universal access to online teaching, this is problematic. So it's posed as a statement. It's Hackney Council. Thank you, Soraya. It's posed as a statement, but actually, clearly there's a question behind it, what the union is doing on that. And I'm going to ask a related question, and Mary, if you can take these as a pair. Joe Sargent says, learning from home is difficult for many children. What would you advise local councils to do to support them more? I think that's a key question, once again, and ties in very nicely with Soraya's question. So thank you to Joe. Once again, you might want to let us know where you're from, Joe. Mary, if you would, please.
Well, thank you. I think those are two absolutely vital questions. And indeed, we produced our first paper on rotas, and sometimes you have to work at speed. And we did have to work at speed looking at the infection rates. But then we very quickly realised we needed to say something about how that would work. We think that probably you could really start thinking about rotas from year 9. That's about the age where young people could be expected in most circumstances to stay at home. But if we're going to have rotas and remote learning, you've got to have the IT equipment. You're absolutely right. The other issue, of course, is broadband costs. Gavin Williamson did talk about the broadband companies reducing their costs, but that hasn't happened. But they are very significant and wouldn't be unaffordable for many low-income families. So we're campaigning just on a national level. We're campaigning and we're repeatedly making the point that 700,000 children and young people can't access remote learning, either because they don't have laptops or because they don't have access to the internet. So 60,000 children have no access to the internet at all. The government's provided just over 220,000 laptops, but that leaves nearly 500,000 children and young people without the access, without the means to access remote learning. That's 500,000 children and young people. So when we're talking about rotas are increasing, our thinking is increasing that schools will have to do an audit of which pupils could learn remotely. We think that rotas probably just aren't possible really for primary, because primary children will, if they're at home, they will need supervision by their parents. Their parents can't work, but also it's very difficult to see how they would learn remotely. But secondary, from year 9, if students have access to equipment and can access the internet, then it becomes a possibility for them. So for those that it doesn't, we're campaigning that the government has to make good on its promise to provide internet access and to provide laptops. But practically, because we think that that is not likely to happen, practically that means schools would have to audit, who's got laptops, who's got the means to work remotely. And if students don't have, then they wouldn't be on a rota, they would be in school. The number of pupils on site would still be greatly reduced, but they would need to be given the opportunity to stay in school and either learn remotely in school or learn in person in school and college. When it comes to councils, I haven't thought of this previously, and I know how cash-strapped you are, but I do think libraries are incredibly important. They're closed during the lockdown at the moment, But libraries with access to free Wi-Fi and with the resources there, they're warm, are really important to particularly young people. We're hearing tales now of young people sitting in McDonald's because they get free Wi-Fi. They're doing their work. You know, sitting anywhere where you can get free Wi-Fi. So libraries are really, really important institutions. They hold a community together. And in a time of COVID, libraries can be a place where young people who are not in school can be warm. They can be in a safe environment, an environment which is conducive to learning, and they can get access to the internet. There may be even devices that they can use in the library. So certainly libraries become really, really important.
Thank you very much.
Something on that as well, Robin.
So I missed that.
Can I just say something on something that I think councils could do is just to sponsor a discussion in schools about how rotas might work. What we have in our sixth form experience, we've got a Google group of our sixth form members, and in that discussion, I'm in that discussion, I look at it, and there's this real depth of discussion that our members are having about which software to use for this rota working, which is the best hardware for children to have at home, which are the best teaching techniques to use. So there is a real depth of expertise in the profession. And I think the government hasn't started that discussion. So I think it might be possible just for the council to work with head teachers on organising a discussion, some local groups that look at the questions that Mary was raising about how we get the equipment to people, but also the best teaching techniques, etc. I think that would be a really useful contribution that councils could make, because I think we will end up teaching in rotas, given what we see about the case numbers.
And could Linda Woodings, who has said that 50% of the council tenants don't have access to the internet, could you just tell me, can you put in your chat where you're from, which council? Because that is a very useful information that we can use.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you to Joe Sargent, who posed the question that initiated that. And Joe, I noticed that you have joined us from Bristol today. So thank you for doing that. Please do keep an eye on the chat alongside what's happening with the panel. Councillor Julie Reid from Manchester raising a question about whether any Conservative authorities are seeking to provide free school meal access or equivalent in their areas over the Christmas period. And interesting and very helpful to have that reply from Peter in East Suffolk explaining their intentions to press for some provision of that nature, drawing on the money that's been saved from councillor and officer travel expenses. I think that's a really neat insight, Peter, that I'm sure other councillors can draw on. We're going to move to our next question. It comes from Neil Thomas. We're hoping that Neil's with us and able to join live. I think Neil is joining us from Wales. He'll tell us. And I'm going to be putting, Neil, your question to Kevin. Yeah. You are with us. Fabulous, Neil. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, as you say, I'm I think one of the very few Welshmen on the call. You know that the situation in Wales is very different from that in England. We're coming out of our fire break on Monday. While I'm talking to you, I'm also trying to monitor what our health minister's saying in the daily press conference that we have. But yeah. So we're coming out of lockdown on Monday, but there will still be some measures that are going to be applied because it hasn't gone away. But certainly we think the fire break has had an impact. Our approach in Wales is very different from England, as it is in Scotland. We went into the lockdown a fortnight ago today, and we think that that's had an impact. The responses at the moment all seem to be Anglo-centric, England-centric. We on the Celtic fringes seem to be beyond the pale, I guess, is the to use an Irish connection. But we need to look at the responses that happen. I mean, there's stuff going on online about free school meals and voucher systems and whatever. Wales committed to paying for kids up until next Easter for all holidays. we committed to that weeks and weeks ago, before the Tories kicked it into touch in Westminster. It's not. It is a different approach. It is and we do seem to be having different figures and different ways of working. I know that it's still very bad in the valleys, Bryan and Gwent and Rhondda and so on. But in a lot of the rest of Wales, it is bearing down. My particular county, which is the Vale of Glamorgan, is part of Cardiff in the Vale, and we're doing a lot better, thank you very much, than some areas. But that I guess is a product of geography and the nature of the county, which is more rural and with smaller sort of towns and cities.
Thank you.
My question though is, I know I'm raving. My question though is the different experiences in Scotland and Wales setting an example which perhaps England could be learning from very, very effectively?
Thank you very much, Neil. That's a great question, relevant also to Northern Ireland, I think, where we have members. So Kevin, perhaps you'd like to comment on our response as a union to those different regions. Thank you. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you very much, Neil. And I'm another Welshman on the call, from Pontypridd originally, nieces and nephews now in Treforest and Treorchy. And we certainly think the attitude of the Wales government has been much better. As you say, the Wales government used the opportunity of half term, went into a circuit break over half term when schools were closed, then also extended the school closure for some years in secondary schools, those years 9 and above. And we think that will have had a positive effect on the COVID rate. We obviously all wait on tenterhooks to see the data. The ONS figures I was talking about earlier on, from their representative sample, they are actually UK-wide figures, which has both strengths and disadvantages, because we might not see the effect in Wales in those figures, or it might depress the figures which are still going up in England from the Wales example. But the Wales and Northern Ireland example, both on the circuit break and on the provision of free school meals, we think really matter. We still think we should be looking, depending on the data, but the cases are still high in Wales, and we hope that the circuit break will bring them down in the way that you described. There do seem to be positive signs. We still think that looking at the possibility of rota working in secondary schools could still be necessary, given just what we are seeing about the rate of growth of the virus, which comes essentially from, we believe, the fact that across the UK, we have some of the highest class sizes in Europe and quite small space. The school spaces are not generous, so spaces are cramped when you've got high class sizes. Ventilation is often a problem, and that also is another contributory factor to the virus spreading. But it's really important. There are good examples from Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland that we want to bring into the discussion in England. So thank you very much for raising that.
Thank you, Kevin. And I'm just picking up a couple of points from the chat. We've got Cordelia giving us some really helpful information about circumstances in Torbay. So thank you for doing that, Cordelia. And Mary, I don't know if you saw it, but Linda Woodings was City of Nottingham, who gave us that very
thank you
piece of data. So thank you very much, Councillor Woodings, Councillor Law. And our next question comes from Councillor Skipper. And if you could kindly let us know where you're from, that'd be great. In the news today was the increase in figures relating to child abuse and neglect during the pandemic. I know from family members and friends who are teachers that this is something teachers are extremely concerned about too. How do we combine making schools as safe as possible? We then get the comment, I totally support the NEU's position on this, while making sure vulnerable children are kept in contact with. And as I pass that to you, Mary, just a reflection on the extraordinary contribution of the education workforce right through the first lockdown in remaining open every single day, including holidays, to provide care, support, food and education for children coming out of some of the most challenging homes and in the most vulnerable circumstances. Mary, thank you.
Thank you, Robin. And I think this is an absolutely key issue. We know that rates, so on a national level, we know that rates of child poverty are increasing. We know that now it is the case, and this was getting worse, that in an average class of 30, if you took an average class of 30, of course there's no such thing, but if you average that out, 9 children in that class will be officially in families, living in families which are officially classed as poor. And the majority of those children will be in families where at least one parent or carer is working. So low wages, you know, the inability for many parents to make work pay means that children are poor. And I think that the reaction over half term to Marcus Rashford's campaign, which was also an NEU campaign to have free school meals provided throughout the holidays for all children, the huge reaction to that just shows the depth now and the level of awareness that you know, there are dangers to children when they are not in school. When we asked our members in the survey we did before our conference, 83% of those who responded, and it was a big response, it was over 8,000 members responded, and 83 of them said that they'd seen an increase in poor concentration among pupils. About 20% of members said they'd seen significant increases in pupils coming to school hungry or in inadequate, dirty clothing this term. And in the previous survey that we did, there's one response from a teacher, which I'll never forget, and it went to my heart, when she said, I've got a boy in my class who wears his school trousers back to front because he's got holes in his knees and he doesn't want anyone to see them. Another teacher said, I've got 2 brothers who share a warm coat. We've got school leaders who, in areas of high deprivation, provide breakfast, lunch and a packed meal for going home, have washing machines at school to wash the children's uniforms, have a shoe bank because children are coming to school in summer shoes when it's raining and when it's cold, and they have a shoe bank to provide them with shoes. And the level of deprivation is huge. And if one thing is COVID has shown, one thing it has exposed, it's the lie that all schools do is educate children academically. What it has revealed absolutely clearly is that schools are absolutely at the centre of their communities. They perform a key social community function, particularly in deprived areas. And if schools aren't there, then children suffer. But the problem we have got at the moment is that in secondary, we think that in secondary, the rates of infection will rise so quickly, and also the rates of staff absence will rise so quickly that schools will be forced onto a rota basis. It will just be something they will not be able to continue with the current rates of infection in schools. So in the lockdown, what schools did was that they had staff, teachers and support staff, who were ringing pupils regularly every week, and sometimes more often than that, to find out what was happening to them, particularly those students and pupils, young children, where there were safeguarding concerns, and then flagging those concerns to councils. The decimation of council budgets, the difficulty of recruiting children's social workers because their working lives are so stressed and pressured, the difficulty of keeping children's social work departments running, the difficulty of keeping them running effectively, and the number of children living in poverty. And we know that if you're in poverty, the likelihood is that there will be more safeguarding concerns, there will be more the more difficult, the more dangerous the lives that children lead. And we also know that these problems last with them for a lifetime. So councils can do what they can. Teachers and support staff in schools are doing what they can to protect vulnerable children, to protect disadvantaged children. But whilst we have these endemic rates of child poverty, 9 children in every class of 30 being poor, then there are too many children and too many will slip through the net. And that is just the truth of the matter. And I'm sorry to be so dour about that. I'm sorry that is so serious, but that's the matter. In other countries, you look at the Nordic countries, where you have a much more equal society, and vanishingly small levels compared to our epidemic of child poverty, and you have far less of the issues, the awful issues that so many of our children have to deal with every day. The fact is, we live in a deeply unequal society where far too many of our children are poor, and that means the system cannot cope with that level of poverty, and that's in the end what we have to turn around.
Thank you very much, Mary. And that was rooted from a question in Croydon. So thank you for that. And we've just posted in the chat, Henry posted in the chat, the link to our councillor's letter that's going to the Prime Minister. And we would ask all of you, please, to try and locate that in the chat. You may have to scroll up just a little bit to see it. It's a link that takes you directly to a web page. And on that web page, you can put in your details. You can obviously do that later, but if you click on the link now, it'll open in your browser just while you're in this conversation. And you can fill in your details there. And I did notice earlier that Hilary from Penrith notes that the list of available councils are at local authority level. And I think, Hilary, you said you're a town councillor, Penrith, up in Cumbria. So please just put your name, put after your surname, open brackets, Penrith, close brackets, and then select Cumbria as the local authority. And anyone else who wishes to sign that as a councillor who's in a intermediate tier of government, then please just add your names to that hugely important collective message to the Prime Minister. I'm going to take a question that takes us back onto the exams line. It's going to come to you, Kevin, and it's very straightforward. Can we also add SATs to the work being done in relation to exams? And I'm sure, Kevin, you'll go further than just SATs in your comments.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robin. We are absolutely working on the question of SATs. We work with a campaign group that we actually initiated, More Than a Score. And with that group, we're reaching out to all sorts of school leaders from our union, from other unions. And we've got well-known concerns about the SATs every year. We know that the SATs are there to compare schools, but they are incredibly stressful for students, and we believe they lead to teaching to the test and a real disruption of education. We do think that children need to be assessed. We think schools need to be accountable, but we don't think SATs is the way of doing it, and there are much better ways. And this year, they would be completely without any basis, without any foundation. The idea that they could be, because they do exist to compare schools, that is their function. In this year, they will have no comparable power. They will have no power to compare schools whatsoever. Schools will have very different experiences of the virus. Some schools have already had to send their year 6 classes home for a fortnight, others haven't. This is incredibly disruptive and makes no sense. So we think the SATs, we think the other methods of these high stakes tests in primary schools, none of them make any sense this year because they're all about assessing schools. We don't need any of them. So we think there's all those good reasons why we shouldn't have them this year. And we also think from another point of view, the experience of our members working with children coming back after lockdown is that there is a lot more to do with the young people. Sometimes getting over emotional distress, etc. But they've been locked up in their houses, and we shouldn't be cramming 4 SATs papers with them when we can give them a wider view of education. This year in particular, we can't just think it's education just back as normal in 2019. So we're working with other people. We have petitions around that I'm sure we can get into the chat. We'd very much appreciate your support in saying this year in particular, the SATs, the new times table test, the phonics check, which is none of those in our view should go ahead in this school year.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And we've posted in the chat links that take you to the campaign group More Than a Score that the NEU works really closely with, that campaign group, their webpage, and their petition to drop the SATs. And we've had a request in the chat about making sure that all the various links that we're putting are sent out to participants later. And Henry, thank you for confirming that we're going to be able to do that for all of you. We're now moving into our last set of questions. And there are a set of questions that are interrelated. I'm going to read all three of them, and Mary then ask if you would just respond. So we've got Lee Howgate. Lee is asking, should we insist on mass testing of asymptomatic students and staff for schools to remain open? So that's a testing-based question. Yasmin Brett, in France and Canada, primary pupils are being trained by parents at home to wear masks and then attending school well prepared. Our teachers and pupils need maximum protection. Will be this something to lobby for? So there's a question about the role of mask wearing and where that fits within the NEU's campaigning. And John Wiseman, should we have a circuit breaker before Christmas so that we can make a fresh start in the new year? So these are all different approaches to minimizing the risk, but also minimizing transmission. Mary, perhaps if you could comment on those, and then Kevin, I'll just come to you for a final word, please, if you would. Mary.
Well, I'd like Kevin to comment on the circuit breaker because he's just analysed the latest ONS figures for secondary school students, and they've gone down after half term. So I've not been able to look at that, and it takes me longer to understand the figures. So I'd like him to answer the circuit breaker question. Not that I can't not understand the figures, it just takes me a little longer. I spell better than he does, so we all have our strengths. The mass testing of asymptomatic pupils, yes, we do. Kevin mentioned that in the talk. Yes, we're very interested in what's happening in Liverpool. And, if we could get mass testing, then that would just be a game changer for schools. It would mean that you don't have staff, you don't have students who are asymptomatic in school spreading the virus, because, secondary schools have an oversubscribed secondary school has a 97% occupancy rate. That means, and the government's given up on social distancing in schools. When you have year group bubbles, which are 180 pupils, what you've got, and they call that cohort distancing. Well, that is not social distancing, and that is why the rate of transmission when students are in school is growing. So yes, we absolutely believe there should be asymptomatic testing. Now, the issue of masks. 2 days ago, the government issued new guidance. The DfE issued new guidance, which said that masks in communal areas for secondary schools were no longer an option, but were required. So now we have it in secondary schools, in corridors, in halls, in all communal spaces. Everyone needs to wear a mask. They're not saying that masks are needed in communal areas in primary school, and they're not saying that masks are needed in classroom. We have a mixed response from members about this. Some members are really, really keen that everyone wears a mask all the time. Other members, particularly our primary members, just think it would be a nightmare, and because children would fiddle with them, there'd have to be constant supervision, trying to get all primary pupils to get their masks on their nose and their mouth. And the fact of the matter is, the evidence is that primary pupils don't transmit in anything like the way that secondary pupils do. The evidence is so. So is it worth it, and would it be practical? Our members have clear doubts about that. What we are clear about is that any of our members who want to wear masks should be able to do so. And we're also clear that the WHO guidance, which is that teachers and adults in schools over 60 or who are vulnerable or clinically vulnerable should wear medical grade masks, then we are very clear that that should be the case as well. But we are not saying that all pupils should wear masks at all times. Early years and primary, we don't think that's possible. And secondary, we think it would be very difficult. And we think that, teachers and sports staff could be spending their time telling children to put masks on rather than using that time more effectively in school. But any member, any adult who wants to wear a mask must be supported to do so.
Thank you very much, Mary. I'm going to pass over to Kevin. You have the opportunity to comment on that particular question about circuit breaker. And then please, if you would, just leave our councillors with a few final thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robin. The question of the circuit, we called for the circuit breaker in England over half term, like the circuit breaker that happened in Wales and the circuit breaker that happened in Northern Ireland. Mary said, we've just received the latest figures from the Office of National Statistics. They've just updated them on their website. And it's as we predicted. The closure of schools over half term has depressed the rate of the virus in secondary schools. So instead of continuing that upward trend, instead of it being 50 times, it's dropped back to 38 times the rate in September, still a lot longer than in September. That confirms us, in our view, that a period of school closure can massively suppress that virus level. So that confirms us in our view, and means that we really want to come back to this question of rotas. We think that really matters, as well as that mass testing of asymptomatic people that people are just asking the question about. If I was going to finish with something, I just want to say to you, thank you for being on this call with us today. People know the name of the National Education Union now, but we are a relatively new union. We are the amalgamation of the National Union of Teachers and the Association of Teachers and Lecturers. And we believe, Mary and I come from the two historic sections, we believe our new union has come together incredibly well. We think that our union, we've got nearly 450, we've got more than 450,000 members. We're the fourth biggest union in the country, the largest union that's not affiliated to any political party, the biggest education union in Europe. We think that we were really important in the school funding fight. Our School Cuts website, we think, has led to improvements in the situation in school funding, at least at some level. We think we've been important in the public debate over COVID. We want to work with anyone we can work with. We set up the councillors network during that school funding debate, and we have members of our NEU councillors network from all political parties. And if you're not a member, we would really urge you to join our network. You don't have to agree with everything that we say, but we can brief you on things and we can urge you to take action along with us. We had councillors, 1,000 councillors sign a letter that we took to the Chancellor about school funding. There are many things that we could work on together. So please do, if you've enjoyed being on this call with us, tell councillor friends about that and do join our network. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for being with us today. It's been great. The questions have been great. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Mary. Thank you to Sam Riddle on BSL interpretation. Thank you to the technical team. And thank you to every councillor who has taken the time to join this call. We know the superb work you're doing in seeking the very best circumstances for all who live in your areas. And we know that there is real strength in working together on all those challenging issues that affect the young people who attend our schools and colleges and the staff who work there. Thank you for joining us. Have a very good afternoon.